Back in the summer of 1976, I learned about something that still crawls under my skin whenever I think about it. 3 kids were discovered living down in a root cellar under what folks in the area called the old Fowler place, way out in the deep backwoods of eastern Kentucky. These kids didn't have birth records, medical files, family photos, nothing that proved they'd ever officially existed. And when the state finally managed to get blood samples from them, the tests came back with a note so strange it was locked away for 3 decades. Their genetic markers didn't line up with any known human population. The woman in the lab who ran those tests quit her job 2 days later. She never went on record, never explained why. After that, the kids were separated. Their case files got buried under mountains of paperwork nobody wanted to touch, and the Fowler house itself mysteriously burned down. People like to call stories like this folklore or tall tales. This wasn't one of them. This wasn't some spooky campfire yarn. It was a chapter that someone worked very hard to erase from the collective memory. And tonight, I'm going to walk you through why that happened. Before we dive in, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Doing that helps YouTube keep sending you stories like this. Now, the Fowlers, they'd been tucked into those mountains since before the Civil War, maybe even earlier, depending on who you asked. They lived in a way that wasn't just private. It was like isolation had become their creed, their shield, maybe even their curse. The closest town was Harlan, about 17 miles down a road that turned straight to mud half the year. Folks in Harlan talked about the Fowlers the same way you might talk about a wasp nest up in your attic. You know it's there, but you sure don't go poking at it. Nobody asked questions, nobody went visiting, and everyone pretty much agreed that some doors ought to stay shut. But in '76, a social worker named Margaret Vance decided she couldn't look the other way anymore. She'd been hearing rumors, stories about kids living up on that property, kids who had never seen a doctor or a teacher or anyone beyond that mountain. And she'd heard other things too, the kind whispered only after someone checked over their shoulder. Tales of strange lights flickering in the woods and noises that didn't sound like anything born in those hills. So one Tuesday morning in June, Margaret drove her car as far up the mountain as the rutted path would let her, then got out and walked the last half-mile. She later wrote, though her statement was sealed away, that the first thing she noticed was the stillness. No birds calling, no bugs humming, just her own breath and the occasional twig snapping under her boots. When she finally stepped into the clearing, she found the house. If you could even call it that. It looked like it had been cobbled together over generations. Rooms added on without any rhyme or reason. Boards rotting into older boards, and windows covered with tar paper and scraps of cloth. The smell hit her next. Something she couldn't quite name. Organic but wrong. Like meat left out in warm air long enough to trouble your conscience. She called out once. No answer. Called again. And that's when she heard it. A faint sound drifting up from beneath the floorboards, from under the house itself. Children's voices. But they weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any indigenous language she knew, either. It sounded ancient or invented, or maybe like it was never meant for human tongues at all. Behind the house, Margaret found a small wooden door, so weathered it blended into the ground. She lifted it and discovered a root cellar that went down far deeper than any cellar needed to. 15 feet, maybe more, lined with stacked stone and packed clay. And down at the bottom, in the thin light leaking through cracks overhead, she found them. 3 children. There were 3 of them down there, 2 girls and a boy. I'd guess they were somewhere between 8 and 12 years old, though nobody ever managed to pin down their exact ages with any kind of certainty. Their skin wasn't just pale from living underground. It had this almost see-through look, like you could trace the blue veins under it the same way you'd follow rivers on a map. And their eyes? They were bigger than they should have been, and they reflected light the way an animal's eyes do when you catch them in a beam from a flashlight. They didn't scream when they saw Margaret. They didn't try to run. They just stood there staring at her, with an expression she later described, very carefully, as recognition. Like they'd been waiting for someone to finally show up. Like they knew this moment was coming. Their clothes looked handmade, pieced together from old feed sacks or maybe torn curtains. All of it stained with dirt and something darker she didn't want to think too hard about. Their hair had been clipped so close it was practically shaved. And when Margaret stepped a little closer, She noticed markings on their scalp. Not scars exactly, but symbols etched or burned into their skin long ago, healed over yet still clear as day. Circles wrapped inside bigger circles, lines that branched out like roots or tangled veins. When she asked for their names, the oldest girl opened her mouth and let out a sound that wasn't anything you'd call speech. It was something halfway between a whisper and a humming vibration, and it made Margaret's teeth hurt just hearing it. She asked them where their parents were. The boy didn't say a word, he just pointed straight up toward the house, then down toward the earth under their feet. And in that moment, Margaret realized she did not want an explanation for whatever that gesture meant. She radioed for backup, and within 3 hours the place was crawling with county sheriffs, state troopers, and 2 men in plain suits who never gave their names. Those 2 took control the second they stepped out of their car. That same day, the children were carried out wrapped in blankets and loaded into waiting vehicles, while officers combed through the Fowler house trying to figure out who had kept these kids hidden, and for what purpose. What they uncovered inside the house was worse than anything anyone had prepared for. It was clear the place had been abandoned, but not recently abandoned. More like time had settled on everything and stopped moving. Dust coated every inch. Food in the cupboards had broken down into powder. The furniture sat in strange, unsettling arrangements. Chairs pressed tight against walls, tables flipped upside down, mattresses ripped open and scattered like something had clawed its way out of them. In the room that seemed to serve as a kitchen, investigators found shelves lined with jars, hundreds of them. Each jar held preserved organs, and later inspections showed they'd come from multiple species. Some were identifiable: deer hearts, rabbit kidneys. Others, well, the medical examiner couldn't match them to anything in the region. His notes used phrases like unknown mammalian tissue and cellular architecture inconsistent with local fauna. But none of that compared to what they found in the back room, the one with the door boarded shut from the outside. 2 officers walked in, took one look around, and later filed for immediate transfers off the case. The walls were covered in writing floor to ceiling. Not English. Not any alphabet anyone recognized. The symbols matched the ones carved into the children's scalps. Mixed with the writing were drawings, crude but disturbingly detailed, of figures shaped almost like people but not quite right. Too many joints in the fingers, eyes a little too wide apart, limbs bent in ways human limbs aren't meant to bend. And right in the center sat a table. Leather straps were bolted to it, worn smooth from use and stained with substances that later tested positive for human blood. 3 different blood types, all matching the kids found in the cellar. The 2 men in the unmarked suits photographed everything, gave no explanation, and then ordered the room sealed off. By dawn the next morning, every one of those photographs had vanished from evidence storage, and the officers who'd gone in first were firmly instructed that they hadn't witnessed anything that required remembering. The children were taken to a facility in Lexington, a place that didn't officially exist in any state records. It was the kind of building used when the government wanted things kept nice and quiet. The kids were separated the moment they arrived, put in different wings, examined by doctors who had signed their confidentiality agreements long before they stepped through the door. The first medical reports painted a picture that should have been impossible. Their bones were too light for their age and size. Their internal temperature stayed around 94 degrees, far below any normal human baseline. And their heart rates were so slow they should have been in critical condition, yet they were calm, alert, completely unbothered. The blood tests turned up things so strange that the examining doctor, a man named Raymond Holt, wrote in his notes that they needed geneticists and maybe even virologists involved right away. But those consultations never happened. Before anyone could even begin to wrap their heads around what they were looking at, a lab tech named Patricia Gomez flagged the children's samples. And from that moment on, everything shifted. Patricia had been in the genetics lab at the University of Kentucky for more than a decade, 11 years of steady, careful work. She wasn't the type to panic or make wild assumptions. She'd handled thousands of samples and seen all kinds of weird but harmless variations in human genetics. But when the Fowler kids' blood came across her bench, first one sample, then the next, then the third, she froze. She sat there at her workstation for 20 full minutes without moving before she finally reached for the phone and called her supervisor. The karyotype was wrong. The chromosome count itself was normal, 46 chromosomes in 23 pairs. But the banding patterns didn't match anything she'd ever seen. There were sequences in those strands that shouldn't even exist. Genes that didn't match any documented human haplogroup on the planet. When she pushed the samples through the comparison programs to identify their maternal and paternal lineages, the computer struggled, spit back errors, and refused to place the kids anywhere on the human family tree. Not European, not African, not Asian, not Indigenous American, nothing. The genetic signatures stood alone, like they belonged to a branch of humanity that had broken away from the rest of us so long ago that the split had become foundational. Patricia ran the tests again, thinking contamination, thinking bad reagents, thinking anything except the implication staring her in the face. The numbers came back identical. She expanded the scope, digging into the mitochondrial DNA, the part passed down through mothers, practically unchanged across thousands of years. Normally, mitochondrial DNA tells the story of humans moving across the world, tied together by ancient migrations and shared origins. But the Fowler kids' mitochondrial DNA told a story no one expected. The sequences looked impossibly old, with mutation rates suggesting they'd been genetically separate from every other known human lineage for somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 years. That couldn't happen. There isn't a tribe on Earth so isolated that long. Not in the Amazon, not in Papua New Guinea, nowhere. And yet, these kids were related to each other. That part made sense. The tests showed they were siblings or maybe very close cousins. But their link to the rest of humanity was faint, almost theoretical. You could see the structure of something human in them, something familiar, but it was as if they'd branched off from us ages ago and taken a path no one else followed. Patricia's supervisor had her run the tests a third time, standing right behind her as she worked. When the same results appeared again, he quietly grabbed a different phone. One she'd never seen him use. For hours later, two men walked into the lab. They weren't doctors. They weren't university administrators. Their badges said they were federal employees, but the agencies printed on them were made of acronyms Patricia didn't recognize. They took everything, the samples, the printouts, the raw digital data, every page of her handwritten notes. Then they questioned her. Who had seen the results? Who else had access? Had she copied anything? Had she shared anything with anyone outside the lab? She told them the truth. She told no one. She could barely comprehend it herself. The men seemed pleased with that answer. They thanked her for cooperating and explained, in the calmest tone, that the samples were part of a classified medical study. The abnormalities she'd found, they said, were nothing more than contamination from the experiment. Nothing to be worried about. Patricia nodded, said she understood. 2 days later, she walked out of that lab for good and never worked in genetics again. She kept her silence, too. And in 2009, 3 years after lung cancer took her life, her daughter found a key to a safety deposit box tucked among her things. Inside was one sheet of paper. On it were 3 names and a short, shaky sentence. They weren't human, not completely, and someone knew before they were ever found. Within 72 hours of their DNA being flagged, the 3 Fowler children were split up. No one at the facility was given a reason. No official transfer forms were ever logged. They were simply there one day, and gone the next. The 3 kids vanished from their rooms in the middle of the night. No warnings, no explanations, just gone. They were moved by men who flashed credentials but never offered names, then loaded into vehicles headed to places that were never written down in any file the public would ever see. When Margaret Vance, the social worker who'd first found them, tried to follow up like she would with any other case, she got fed rehearsed lines about how the kids had been placed with specialized foster families and were receiving the proper care. They told her she could step back now, that her part was finished. But Margaret wasn't the type to let something like that go without answers. She pushed back, asked where they'd been taken, who was caring for them, and when she could conduct follow-up visits. And that's when she got called into a meeting with her supervisor and 2 men claiming to be from the Department of Health and Human Services. They thanked her for her dedication. They smiled. They told her the children were safe. And then, with those same polite voices, They warned her that asking more questions could be interpreted as interfering with a federal investigation into child abuse and endangerment. Margaret had been in social services for 19 years by then. She'd seen kids pulled from homes filled with violence, neglect, addiction, situations that broke her heart daily. But she had never, not once, watched a case shut down with this kind of forceful finality. She backed off. She stopped asking. But she didn't forget. At home, she kept a hidden file filled with every copy she'd managed to make before the case closed over her like a steel trap. The oldest girl, the one who'd made that strange humming sound instead of answering her name, was supposedly sent to a facility in West Virginia. The paperwork described it in vague terms. A private institution for developmental disorders and genetic conditions requiring long-term residential care. No specifics. No oversight. Former staff who've spoken anonymously said the place felt like a cross between a hospital and a research lab. Kids studied under the language of treatment. The girl was given a name, Sarah Fowler. Whether that was truly her name or just a label pulled from the property she'd been found on, no one could say. Records show she stayed there until at least 1983. After that, her trail disappears. Completely. No death certificate. No school record. No medical file. No driver's license applications. Not even a social security blip after 83. It's as if she evaporated from the world. The younger girl and the boy were separated and sent in opposite directions, one to upstate New York, the other somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, maybe Oregon or Washington. Their paper trails are even thinner. Their assigned names show up occasionally in late 70s and early 80s documents, always in context suggesting ongoing observation and testing. One file pried loose through a FOIA request in 2012 mentions subjects 2 and 3 from the Kentucky relocation. The document talks about continued monitoring of genetic anomalies and behavioral development in controlled environments. But huge sections are blacked out, entire paragraphs swallowed by ink. What's legible is enough to make your stomach twist. Notes about unusual physiological reactions to environmental stimuli, struggles with language and social interaction even under intense intervention. And one single line near the bottom, recommendation. Maintain separation from general population indefinitely. Subjects display signs of recognition and distress when visual contact occurs, suggesting persistent psychological linkage despite physical distance. If you're still listening to this, you're already braver than most people I've talked to. Let me ask you something. If this were your bloodline, what would you want to uncover? And what truth would you be terrified to face? After the kids were taken and the Fowler house went up in flames, investigators tried to trace the family's past, hoping to understand where those children came from and what had happened to them on that mountain. What they found was a genealogical labyrinth. A family tree twisted in on itself, the branches looping and folding the way you'd expect after generations of isolation and intermarriage. County documents stretching back to the 1800s showed Fowlers buying and selling that same acreage, always keeping it in the family and staying distant from every community around them. Census records were inconsistent, but whenever a Fowler listing did appear, the numbers were small, never more than 6 or 7 people in any household. More often than not, census takers scribbled frustrated notes about strange speech patterns, evasive answers, uncooperative behavior. One entry from 1890 included a remark written in the margin. Family uncooperative. Strange dialect. Counted 8 individuals but could not verify names or ages. Recommend additional assistance on next visit. Local churches kept no record of them whatsoever. No baptisms, no marriages, no burials. The Fowlers handled all that on their own land. Investigators eventually located the family cemetery, sitting near the tree line. The oldest markers went back to the 1820s. Most were little more than stones with dates scratched in. But a few had symbols carved into them, the same symbols found on the walls of that sealed room and etched into the children's skin. In 1978, 2 years after the discovery, archaeologists were finally allowed to survey the site. They found far more graves than markers. Ground-penetrating radar revealed at least 40 burial sites, probably more, stacked and layered over more than a century. The state pushed to exhume some remains for identification and cause-of-death analysis. But federal officials shut that down, claiming the land was contaminated from the fire and any excavation posed health risks. The cemetery was fenced off. Within 5 years, the forest swallowed it whole. Oral histories from elderly Harlan residents painted the Fowlers as people the town had always avoided. Their grandparents had warned them about the family when they were children. Tales surfaced of Fowler men drifting into town to trade furs or herbs, paying with old coins, speaking only when necessary, watching with eyes that made folks uneasy. Stories about the women, rarely seen, moving through the trees like pale shapes that didn't exactly walk but glided, almost floating between shadows. And then the darker stories, the ones whispered only when lanterns burned low. Rumors of children going missing in the 1890s near Fowlerland, 3 in 2 years never found. Hunters returning from the woods shaken, sleepless, claiming they'd heard sounds at night that didn't belong to any creature they knew, and seen lights weaving through the trees that moved like they had purpose, intelligence. One old man, interviewed in '77 just before he died, said his grandfather told him the Fowlers weren't originally from Kentucky. They'd come up from somewhere farther south, maybe the Carolinas or Georgia, running from something, chased by people who wanted them dead for reasons never explained. Researchers tried to follow the surname backward through history, hunting for an origin point. They found a family named Fowler living in the mountains of North Carolina in the early 1800s, caught up in some dispute with local authorities that left several people dead. After that, the entire family disappeared from record. And before that, nothing. The trail went cold, like they had simply stepped out of the woods one day with no past anyone could trace. There were no ship registers, no immigration trails, no land grants, no deeds, nothing that showed how the Fowlers got to those mountains. It was as if the family simply appeared one day in the Appalachians around the early 1800s, tucked themselves into the hills, and stayed hidden for generations. Whatever they were guarding in their bloodline, whatever they refused to let dilute or disappear, those 3 kids found in 1976 were the final product. They were living proof that something had survived up there in the mountains, something that looked human enough to blend in but wasn't human enough to explain. The Fowler case was officially sealed in 1977, barely a year after the kids were found. Every scrap of documentation, police records, medical files, DNA reports, placement histories, was locked under federal classification. The justification? National security and ongoing sensitive research. Margaret Vance's reports vanished from state archives. The Harlan County police files were plucked from storage and never returned. Even the photographs taken by local journalists before the house burned were seized by federal agents who handed out receipts that no one ever honored. The public version, the one that showed up in the handful of newspapers before everything went dark, said 3 neglected children were found on an abandoned property and taken into protective custody. That was it. No mention of DNA that didn't match humanity. No mention of carved symbols or strange languages. Nothing to hint that this was anything more than a tragic case of rural child abuse. The property itself was locked down for decades. In 1978, the federal government seized the land through eminent domain and handed it to the Department of the Interior. They declared it protected wilderness, too dangerous for public access due to terrain instability and environmental hazards. Folks who've tried to reach the site in recent years say the old access road has been swallowed by forest, and every newer road is blocked by gates warning of dangerous conditions and legal consequences for trespassing. Even satellite images of the area look suspicious. Public mapping tools show a dense, featureless canopy. No buildings, no clearings. Just a patch of low-resolution forest that looks blurrier than everything around it. Some researchers think the imagery has been replaced or degraded on purpose. Others chalk it up to a quirk of how the data was processed. But the pattern fits too neatly with the way the Fowler case has been handled from day one. In 2006, 30 years after the discovery, a researcher named Daniel Merrow filed a FOIA request demanding every document connected to the Fowler case and the children taken from that Kentucky mountain in 1976. His request was denied. He appealed. Denied again. So he sued, arguing that any real security concerns should have long expired. The court shut him down, claiming the documents were tied to ongoing medical privacy issues and couldn't be released. Merrow didn't stop. He shifted his focus to finding the children themselves, now middle-aged adults. Using the names they'd been given and the bits of information he'd pried loose, he searched across states, databases, public records, everything he could legally access. He found nothing. No Sarah Fowler who matched the right age. No trace of the boy or the younger girl under any variation of their assigned names. It was like the children had been erased just as thoroughly as the paperwork. Removed from the world without leaving even the smallest footprint. Marrow died in 2011. His research notes, full of redacted pages and unanswered questions, ended up in a university archive. People still sift through them, hoping for something. A crack, a lead, a stray clue. But mostly they find dead ends that raise more questions. Some folks out there believe the children are still alive, hidden in facilities that don't appear on any map, subjects of research that will never see daylight or reach a peer-reviewed journal. Others think the children died long ago, maybe from complications tied to whatever their biology really was, or maybe because someone decided they were too dangerous to keep alive. And then there are the people who believe something darker, that the Fowler kids weren't the only ones, that there are other families tucked away in other isolated places, carrying the same ancient divergence, that the Fowlers were just one branch of something older than the country itself, something that split off from humanity long before history began keeping score. The truth, whatever it is, lies buried under layers of classification, bureaucracy, and fear. Fear of what it would mean if people knew that human beings might not be the only ones who've been walking these hills. Fear that something old, something strange, has been hiding in the shadows this whole time, preserving a lineage that doesn't fit the story we tell ourselves about where we come from. Margaret Vance passed away in 2019. After her death, her daughter found the hidden file, copies of the documents Margaret managed to save before the case was sealed. She tried to bring it to journalists, researchers, anyone who might be willing to reopen the investigation. Most people brushed her off. A few took one look at the file and walked away, saying they didn't want to get involved in anything that felt that dangerous. But the file still exists. It's out there in a private collection, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to dig into it. And the Fowler property is still out there too, somewhere under the thick woods of eastern Kentucky. The graves still lie under the soil. The root cellar is still open to the earth below. And somewhere, if they manage to survive, 3 people are living with the truth of what they are, what was done to them, and what their blood carries. They know the truth. The real question is whether the rest of us are ready to know it too, or whether some secrets are best left buried in the mountains, hidden for the last 2 centuries, waiting for the next unlucky soul who goes digging for answers that were never meant to be found.